Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur. I hope that you're doing well. I hope your week is off to a great start. I've been reading a number of books, short stories, various novels, and I've noticed a common thread in them, and I wanted to kind of make a video discussing that, but also get your response on one specific question. And what I've noticed is across a series of short stories, across novels, and I even recognize it in plays I've read, there are authors who will very intentionally use a vernacular or slang or colloquialisms in order to try and achieve a sense of place, and I think to a certain degree a sense of authenticity for the characters and for the work as a whole. And I guess the question I have is, does that translate well? So in your experience, if you're able to read multiple languages, do you find that when you read works in translation that they capture those if you find that an author's doing that in the author's native language? And I think that's the question I have. But I noticed a lot of different examples, and it was kind of wild. I was first thinking about it as Brian from Bookish and I had been reading the USA Trilogy by John Dos Passos. And it was written in the 1930s, and it's set sort of between 1900 and up through where we're at 1920. And it's very clear that different characters, different point of view characters, use different vocabularies. They use different little slang terms. A really simple example would be that they're a character who's part of the IWW doesn't necessarily just refer to them as the Wobblies or as the Radicals, but as workers or comrades or something. And so there's like this one little example there. But even within his more stylistic sections of the camera eye, that first-person narrator is using different language than the characters, and he has characters set across different parts of the U.S. and sort of traveling globally now, and so you really get this sense of different places from the dialogue that characters use and from the vocabulary that characters use in their interior stream of consciousness. And then it was even more magnified as I was reading Ayiti, which is the early collection of short stories from Roxane Gay, and I was kind of reading this with Caribathon. And her stories are trying to capture the diaspora of Haitian individuals. And some of them are in Haiti, some of them are in the U.S. but traveled to Haiti. But throughout it, there's this sense of the language and specifically like the dialect people use, or the little terms that native Haitians will use for those who have left the island or for visiting tourists to the island, and the ways in which characters try to fit in or out. And there's a certain question I think here even of assimilation. Are characters who are using their more native vernacular, their home vernacular, are they the characters who are holding on to their cultural identity and their heritage? Are the characters who aren't doing that, have they assimilated? And I think that's more of an unspoken question within these stories, but it was something that I noticed across both of them. And as that happened, I started to think of around it more and more and more. As I was reading Dos Passos, someone who came to mind was Eugene O'Neill, who's very intentional in his plays around having characters use dialogue that he felt was like in the streets. And I think that was something I noticed with, and that Brian and I spoke about with John Dos Passos, was the idea that Dos Passos is really trying to capture like what did people sound like? What did a person who is a worker sound like? What did a person who was more of a financier or in an advertising agency sound like? What did someone who worked as a secretary in the agency, what did she sound like? And what are those little cues? And I think that's something that Eugene O'Neill was highly attentive to. And so I think the question that comes up with O'Neill is that something that is almost required in plays, where because all the playwright really has is the character's dialogue, is that the only place where that authenticity, that sense of location and background can be captured? I don't know. Another one that I thought was really interesting, and I sort of raised the question of translation, was because I was reading the second series of stories, The Spinoza of Market Street by Isaac Bashevis Singer, and these stories were originally written in Yiddish and then translated into English. But it's also clear that Singer had a sense of, certainly later on in his career, had a sense of being able to like write in Yiddish, or so not just write in Yiddish, write in English. So what are the pieces of that carry through? Because so many of these stories are set in the final generations of the Russian Empire, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, in very small rural Jewish communities in what was called the Russian Pale. And so it's these very, very rural communities, even though it might be the turn of the 20th century. And Singer, I think, gets a sense of place and setting in part from the beliefs of the characters and the traditions he's including in these stories. But there are little pieces where the vernacular seems to pop up, and the little ways in which characters are addressed. So characters are addressed as, Reb so-and-so. Well, that has meaning, that has significance, and that's one of the little cues around what's going on in that community. And so that was something I noticed, that even though this was a work in translation, there's ways in which that vernacular comes through, and it doesn't just have to be through the dialogue. It could be the belief systems of the characters that help provide that sense of authenticity, that sense of place. And then two more recent modern ones, twists on this question. One would be, I've been reading Brave New World, one would be the way in which science fiction tries to show its future sense, its future place, through language. 1984 famously has the the dictionary that gets smaller and smaller and smaller because you're only allowed to use certain words. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley presents a society that is in the future and doesn't really understand the concept of mother or father, because children are, test tube babies at this sense in this distant future. And so father is a word that they have no conception of, and mother is basically like a dirty word, an inappropriate word. And so, science fiction will do that to try and convey that sense of future by showing how the language of the characters has changed, and not necessarily by just including new vocabulary about new technologies, but the ways in which the society itself has changed. Joe Haldeman's Forever War certainly explored that really well. And the other one would be, those are all books that for the most part are written in a time and place, except for Brave New World. The other examples are books that are written in a time and place, trying to sort of show that time and place. Singer's, a little bit removed. But then you have writers who intentionally use the slang or the vernacular of a prior time in order to try and show that authenticity. I think someone who's notable for doing that would be James Ellroy. He's writing these books in the 1980s, 1990s, the 21st century, but he is really trying to capture the slang of the late 1940s, the 1950s, and then even into, with his Underworld USA trilogy, the 1960s, where he has characters consistently, like in their dialogue or in their interior monologues, using, slang and colloquialisms. Now, it's important to note that with Ellroy, part of that would then include like racist terms, homophobic terms, that characters just toss off. And one of the things that's also curious is the ways in which he shows the different like social status of characters by sort of the crowds they run with, but then also the slang that they use, and so how that differs across the different characters. And then another writer who does that in a similar way, I find, would be David Peace, with his specifically with his Red Riding Quartet, set in Northern England, where the characters use little specific vocabulary and terms, but they have all their little slang for the different things going on, the different criminal elements, the different elements in reporting, or just in the language down at the local pub. So. So I guess I want to come back to that one question of, does this feel like something that can be captured in translation, and what are the other ways in which writers maybe try to capture that sense of authenticity, that sense of setting, beyond just the language that the characters are using and the ways in which that is a vernacular. So I hope everybody's doing well, and I hope your week is getting started well. Thanks.